I don't know about you, but I love to visit beautiful churches. Whenever I travel, one of the things that I always try to do is to find really beautiful and magnificent churches that I just love to go and visit. And, it seems that they kind of don't build them that way anymore. So we wanted to talk about church architecture this morning. So we brought in an expert. Joining us this morning is Steve Baker, who is the principal architect of Baker Architects, here to tell us a little bit more this morning. Steve, good morning. Welcome to Seize the Day.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm very blessed, sir. Thank you. Happy Easter to you, too. It's great to have you here this morning. Now, start off, if you would, Steve, by telling us a little bit about yourself, your career, and how you got into the business of church architecture.
Sure. Like you said, my name is Steve Baker, and I'm a native of Colorado. I was born and raised a Catholic. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Colorado in construction management. I achieved my master's degree in architecture from Colorado University. And I'm currently working on my PhD in exactly Catholic sacred architecture at the University of Colorado. For some reason, I can't find a reason to leave Colorado. Such a beautiful state. And my current topic is on Catholic sacred architecture. So interestingly enough, the University of Colorado embraced that topic, which is interesting for a state college, but they've embraced it, and I'm currently working on my dissertation on it. And my topic basically centers around what makes a Catholic church Catholic, and I'm more interested in how the buildings actually form meaning for the parishioners and for the people experiencing these buildings.
Okay, well, so let me start off then with this.
Mm-hmm.
What makes a Catholic church Catholic?
So what I have found, researching a lot of history here, going back to Aquinas, even back to the Greeks and Aristotle and Plato, that in essence, John Henry Newman called it the incarnational principle. He said that is basically the main principle behind all of Christianity. So if we could find how does the Catholic Church express the incarnational principle, are there patterns and forms in architecture that express that? The Second Vatican Council, the documents suggest that it should be signs and symbols of a heavenly reality. And I don't know about you, but I haven't been to heaven yet. And hopefully not too soon, but
right.
Whenever he does, he calls me, I'll go there.
At the appointed time, right.
Right, exactly. So I'm basically trying to figure out what in churches, Catholic churches, express that. And what I'm finding is that there is a logical, rational, formal side, and then there's also this figural side, which speaks to the heart, speaks to poetry, and speaks to figural languages, metaphors, allegories, and the Catholic Church has really embraced allegorical interpretations of scriptures. So there's something about these figural languages, figural like poetry, metaphors, allegories, analogies is another one that the Catholic Church really embraces. So how do we make these buildings speak to that? And it really gets down to speaking towards our bodily existence on earth. And then, in Genesis, God created the creation and created earth, and he looked at everything and he said it was good. And I think Catholic churches have been able to embrace that idea that creation is good. And how do we express that? Christ came, he also redeemed.
Let me jump in here real quick, Steve. There are
Sure.
so many. There's so much to this, and obviously you're very steeped in this. You've done your research. You're working on your PhD and all that kind of stuff. But let me ask you, when it boils down to it, the people in the pew, do most people get all of the deep meaning and symbolism behind architectural things, or do you think that gets by people? I mean, does that, or do they sort of sink it in without really knowing it? What's your take on that as an architect?
Right. So there is a deep kind of a conceptual knowledge behind exactly what everything means and how we read it, that you almost need a pamphlet to understand it. So Maritain would call that the conceptual knowledge, that we have a rational understanding of it. We also argue that we have a connatural, meaning that we have a co-nature with things. And I think even if you're not a Catholic, you can walk into some of those old European churches and just be moved and see without even understanding any bit of Catholicism. And I think that we have swung a little bit too far in contemporary design towards this rational, logical aspect where you do kind of need the pamphlet to understand the building. And I think we're missing a little bit of what Maritain would call the connatural, or ways that we could feel the building. We don't have to understand it logically and understand exactly what it is, although that is a very important part of Catholic sacred architecture, that we need to be able to feel it a little bit more. And I think some of the more modern buildings, the Los Angeles Cathedral in L.A., the Cathedral of Our Angels, has swung a little bit too far the other way, where it's a more of a deconstructivist, and I cannot understand that building at all. I have to feel.
Said the guy who's working on his PhD in architecture, right?
Right. Yeah, I appreciate what the architect's doing there, but I cannot grasp that idea. The scholastics would call it, I can't grasp its quidditas, or its whatness. In fact, people go, "What is that building?" Right, and that's the first question.
Yeah.
So there is an aspect of churches that need whatness, but they also need a little bit of the Cathedral of the Angels. They need this ability to feel the building.
Okay, all right.
Let me my dissertation here, so I'm going to keep going.
So let me jump in here, because this is really fascinating stuff, and I'm really fascinated by this. But I have to say, first of all, I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. So many modern churches, I think, and look, a lot of people feel, and I feel similarly, that many Catholic churches have been sort of Protestantized these days. They've been sanitized. We've taken away the a lot of the beautiful architecture and the statues, and like the iconoclasm movement of the 1960s really played heavily into this. So, from in looking at history, Steve, how did this all happen? When did this begin? How did it happen? And in your estimation, why?
I could probably take it all the way back to Descartes in the Renaissance, where he started separating basically our mind from our body, which is a very contrary idea from Aristotle and from Aquinas and from Augustine, and basically all of Catholic teaching, that we are this unified body and soul, and that Christ came to sanctify both body and soul. And I think some of the Protestant stuff has pushed a little bit or even the contemporary Catholic architecture has pushed a little bit too far down in just the mind, that a God can exist in the mind. In fact, I hear that quite often when I post pictures of very ornate churches. Why are these Catholic churches so ornate? Most people will respond, not most. Some people will automatically respond, I don't need a church. It's a waste of money. I don't need any of that stuff. Well, that to me is a very enlightened response that, I just need God up in my head. So how do we, as Catholics, embrace both? I think that's what we've done throughout the centuries. I think the modernist mantra of form follows function very much appeals towards that logical head-only approach. So I think with the modernist movement, there was just organize the pieces in the right place. We did a lot of liturgical changing and moving pieces around, and then you just wrap it with a shell, and you should have, in theory, a beautiful building.
Right.
But I think we're finding now that didn't result into too much. And I think the deconstructivists who came after the modernists started swinging the other way, where we just make it all about expression and all about feeling, and we have no logical, rational ordering to the building. So it's a both and. Catholicism has always been a both and.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Talked about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Steve Baker is with us this morning. By the way, he is the principal architect for Baker Architects, and we're talking about church architecture this morning and sort of the trends that it's taken. Now, Steve, are you seeing a move, a swing of the pendulum, if you will, where, the deconstructivists and all this other stuff, they started taking us to more gymnasium-looking buildings. Are you seeing the pendulum swing in the other direction? Are there more churches being built now that are at least a little more ornate, sort of going back to the roots of Catholic architecture, or no?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're, even in the secular world of architecture, they are starting to embrace ornament a lot more. And I think, my dissertation basically centering around this idea of what is ornament. And I think we are definitely swinging back. There's a tendency for people, the first thing I always get when I go to a parish is, can you make us a church that looks like a church, or make it look like a Catholic church?
Right.
And for some reason, us architects during the mid 20th century decided to tell you what it looks like, and I think that upset quite a few people.
Well, but in light of that too, though, Steve, let me say this: I'm sure that in the architectural world, like you said, we're going to tell you what a Catholic church looks like, but somebody had to buy into that. Do you know what I mean? There had to be priests and bishops and whatnot who bought into that whole line and said, well, okay, we'll do it this way, right?
Right.
I mean, it's not like you guys are building churches for free and doing it on your own.
Absolutely. I think former Pope Benedict XVI talked about quite a bit of that, where he said we swung a little bit far and we misinterpreted. We're hearing that quite a bit of the Vatican II documents. I've actually heard from one of my advisors on my council or my PhD committee that Vatican II documents helped stem a tide that was actually existing at the beginning of this century, the 20th century. So there was a movement going along. You can see it in Europe. There's a liturgical reform that was, for lack of a better word, Protestantizing or, iconoclasm. That actually the Vatican II documents, if you read them correctly or interpreted them in a different light than they were interpreted in the 60s and 70s, you would actually see a little bit more of what we're seeing, which embraced that tradition. So we have this huge 2,000-year history of beautiful buildings, and why did we neglect or refuse that? Is an interesting question in itself.
It is. All right. One of the other things that I know a lot of people have a concern about, Steve, these days, especially when it comes to Catholic Church architecture, is this idea of the tabernacle no longer being in the main sanctuary, but rather having like a reservation chapel. Is this something that you're starting to see go away as well? Are you building and getting more interest in people from people who want to build churches where the tabernacle is right behind the altar in the main sanctuary?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I cut my teeth when I was in my master's degree with one of the liturgical reformers here in Colorado. We worked on churches all across the nation. And, I kind of had to take a sabbatical from it because here I was working on these basilicas. And what exactly am I doing here? I'm a fresh student out of college. What am I doing to this? So absolutely, there's a swing back from moving the tabernacle out of the sanctuary. There's definitely trying to get a little more centralized, focused area to the churches. The altar has become a prime expression, which it should be. So, there's obviously some issues with having two altars. We used to have a high altar, then we have a low altar, so it gets a little bit confusing, and I absolutely do see a lot of transitions back towards centralizing around the altar and the tabernacle. The altar question brings up the altar rail, which is always the funnest discussion. I always have that at the very beginning. That's a hot topic as well. What your experience with that would be interesting to hear.
Right. Now, one of the challenges I'm sure that you face these days is with many churches now that are closing, that are consolidating, especially in certain parts of the country. Are you building churches now that are just much bigger because, instead of having 10 parishes in a small geographic area, now you've got the one parish, so it's got to hold more people. Is this a challenge that you as an architect are facing more and more?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're looking mostly at about 1,000 seats to 1,500, even 2,000, and everybody wants to be close to the altar, so that becomes a very challenging task to get that many people near the altar if that is one of the requirements. So you start to take away columns and get large spans, and you get one unified massive space that when it's that big, it loses a lot of the complexity and a lot of the mystery that exists in the smaller churches where you had colonnades, you had separation of space, you can pull out shrines, and I think we do miss quite a bit of that. So, yeah, us architects have been giving us that big challenge of trying to coordinate those two. And it's a trick. It is hard.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. And yet, we see a lot of, as we've been talking about, the great cathedrals of old. When you go to Europe and you see these magnificent structures and whatnot, many of them are very large and they'll hold an awful lot of people. So you are then starting to see a trend of churches or pastors, bishops, etc., wanting their churches to be built, maybe not necessarily in the old Gothic style, but not necessarily in the minimalist style that we've seen over the past 40 or 50 years, correct?
Right, correct. And I like to call that dynamic orthodoxy, where we have a devotion to the tradition and the ornamentation. We're not devout modernists who want to strip it all away. We don't think ornamentation is a crime. but how do we make it dynamic still? So how do we allow the Holy Spirit to still inform our churches? And I think a lot of that comes through the ornamentation, the ability to express how we see Christ today, and through the artistry. I think the overall shape really doesn't need to change too much. It does become a trick when you're trying to put 1,000 people around the altar, but if you want to put 1,000 people in line in more of a processional, traditional ordering, we can absolutely do that. We just need to extend the building longer. So the trick becomes, how do we retain the orthodoxy, but yet still make it open to the Holy Spirit and make it dynamic? And I think we can do quite a bit of that with the artists and through ornamentation.
That's great stuff. Well, God bless you, my brother. I know that, like you said, I know it can be a very delicate line. And look, I'm sure that as an architect, you find you just can't please everybody, right? Invariably, somebody's going to be set off by the things that you do, right?
Absolutely. And I'd like to start this off that, whenever we start a design process, that remember we're all one family of God here. We all have to share the same house.
Right.
That can be tricky sometimes, and we have to be open to what the other person is saying. So I think we don't let egos go, and what other people are saying, and most importantly, what the church is saying about what our churches need to be looking like.
Sure. And like you said, you alluded to on numerous occasions, finding some kind of middle ground. The two ends of the pendulum are probably not the right place to be, but somewhere right around the middle, I'm sure, is a great place to be. Steve, fascinating stuff. Thank you very much for being with us today, and a very blessed and happy Easter to you and your family.
You too. Thank you very much.
Honored to have you. Steve Baker, Principal Architect for Baker Architects, here this morning on Seize the Day, and I'm Gus Lloyd.